The world had changed in a matter of months. Once thriving cities now lay in ruins, their towering skyscrapers half collapsed, windows shattered, and streets filled with silence. The world's major governments had fallen one by one as the infected spread like wildfire, sweeping across the continents in an unstoppable wave. What had started as a series of isolated outbreaks turned into a global catastrophe, an apocalypse that threatened to wipe out the very essence of humanity. It began with the outbreak of a mysterious virus, initially believed to be a simple flu-like illness. Those who contracted it displayed symptoms of fever, hallucinations, and violent aggression. Soon, the symptoms became more pronounced, victims stopped being human at all. They became ravenous, mindless creatures, driven solely by the hunger for human flesh. Their bodies decayed quickly, but it didn't matter, the hunger never waned. Once infected, there was no going back. They became zombies, soulless, relentless monsters. A few lucky survivors had managed to escape the initial outbreak, fleeing to the countryside or seeking shelter in isolated communities. Among them was a group of brave souls holed up in an old, abandoned military base on the outskirts of what was once a bustling city. This group, led by Major Emma Carter, was part of a desperate effort to protect what remained of humanity and to fight back against the ever-growing Horde. The base had been designed to withstand nuclear strikes, but it wasn't invulnerable. The infected had begun to encircle it, closing in like a pack of hungry wolves. Emma had seen the signs: barricades weakening, ammunition running low, and morale faltering. They could only hold on for so long. With each passing day, the walls seemed to inch closer to collapse. Inside the base, Emma stood before a group of survivors, her military uniform torn and dirt-streaked, her face etched with exhaustion. Her once bright, confident eyes now carried the weight of responsibility. Around her stood a handful of soldiers, engineers, and civilians, each with their own stories of loss, but united in a single purpose: survival. "Listen up," Emma called out, her voice steady despite the strain. "The Horde is getting closer. We don't have the luxury of time anymore. We need a plan, and we need it fast." Private Nathan Mills, a former technician who had become one of Emma's most trusted allies, stepped forward. His hands were shaking, but his words were resolute. "We can't keep hiding forever. We've got to find a way to push back or we're all dead. The infected are smart. They know we're here." Emma nodded grimly. "I know. That's why we're going to have to do something drastic. We need to take the fight to them." A murmur of concern rippled through the group. The idea of leaving the safety of the base and facing the infected head-on was a terrifying prospect. But Emma knew it was their only chance. "We'll have to use the supplies we have left. We've got enough explosives to make a dent. Nathan, I want you to start working on something that will give us a few hours head start. We need to draw the Horde away from the base long enough to make a break for it." Nathan hesitated, his eyes darting around at the others. "It's dangerous, Major. If we go out there, we might not come back." Emma's eyes softened, but her voice didn't falter. "We don't have a choice. This base can't protect us forever. If we stay here, we'll be sitting ducks. We either fight, or we die." The room fell silent, each person processing the harsh reality of Emma's words. Then, slowly, one by one, they nodded in agreement. They had no illusions of victory, only the grim resolve to keep fighting for another day. As the meeting ended, the survivors went to work, preparing for the impossible. They knew the odds were stacked against them, but for the first time in weeks, there was a spark of hope. A glimmer of defiance. They weren't going to just sit and wait for the end. They were going to fight back. Outside the base, the sky was heavy with dark clouds, the air thick with the stench of decay. In the distance, the faint moans of the infected echoed through the empty streets. They were closing in. Emma stepped out onto the command deck, staring out at the horizon. The Horde was out there, a sea of undead that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was only a matter of time before they arrived. But in that moment, Emma Carter made a vow. No matter what it took, humanity would stand its ground. The first phase of their plan would begin at dawn. The struggle for survival had only just begun. The first light of dawn cast a pale glow over the abandoned military base, the soft hum of generators filling the air. Emma stood on the roof, surveying the vast wasteland that had once been a thriving metropolis. The buildings now lay in ruins, and the streets were silent except for the occasional rustle of the wind or the distant groans of the infected. But she knew that peace would not last long. The Horde was coming, and time was running out. Her thoughts were interrupted by Nathan's voice crackling through the comms. "Major, we're ready. The explosives are set. Just need your signal." Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She glanced around at the others. Soldiers, engineers, civilians, they were all depending on her now. She had never imagined that the decisions she made in the field would one day dictate the survival of so many. But there was no time for second-guessing. They had a plan, and they had to execute it, or they would all die. "Understood," Emma said into the comms, her voice steady. "Prepare to move out. We've got one shot at this." The survivors had managed to set up a series of makeshift traps and explosive devices near the outskirts of the base. The idea was simple: draw the Horde toward the traps, blow them up to create a diversion, and use the chaos to break through the infected ranks. It was a risky strategy, but with their dwindling resources, there was no alternative. As the survivors made their way to their designated positions, Emma's mind raced. What if the traps didn't work? What if the Horde was smarter than they had anticipated? What if they were walking into a trap of their own? But there was no turning back now. With one final glance at the base, she gave the signal to Nathan. "Do it." The ground shook with a deafening roar as the first set of explosives detonated, sending a massive cloud of smoke and debris into the sky. The shockwave rippled through the air, rattling windows and shaking the foundation of the base. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the Horde reacted. A cacophony of growls and shrieks erupted from the distance as the infected, drawn by the noise and the scent of fresh human flesh, began to surge forward in a chaotic, mindless frenzy. The sound of thousands of decaying feet pounding the ground reverberated through the air as they pushed forward like an unstoppable tide. Emma's heart raced as she watched the massive wave of infected heading straight for the traps. The survivors had done their part, now it was up to fate. "Move! Now!" Emma shouted. The survivors, armed with rifles and makeshift weapons, sprinted from the base, their boots pounding against the cracked asphalt. They had to make it to the breach before the infected overran the perimeter. The world seemed to blur as Emma ran, adrenaline pumping through her veins. Behind her, the explosion had created the chaos they needed, but the Horde wasn't slowing down. In fact, it was only growing larger, more ravenous with every passing second. As Emma rounded a corner, she saw the next set of explosives go off in a brilliant burst of flame and smoke. A massive cloud billowed into the sky, blotting out the sun for a moment. The infected closest to the blast were thrown backward, their bodies torn apart in the explosion. It was a sight Emma had seen too many times before, but it never got easier. The undead were relentless, unstoppable, and their numbers were growing. Nathan's voice crackled through the comms again. "The traps are working, Major. But we're not going to have much time. They're getting smarter, we need to move fast." Emma's eyes darted around. The survivors were holding their own, but the infected were quickly closing in on their position. The trap had worked, but now the real challenge was in front of them. They had to fight their way through the Horde to the extraction point, a small, fortified bunker a few miles away. "We need to keep pushing forward," Emma shouted. "Don't stop, no matter what." The survivors fought valiantly, but the infected were everywhere. Their shrieks filled the air as they lunged at the humans, their claws and teeth snapping. Emma fired her weapon with precision, taking down one of the infected that was about to tear into a civilian. But for every one they killed, two more appeared. The wave of undead was endless. Private Mills, who had been running ahead to clear a path, was suddenly knocked to the ground by a horde of infected. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she watched him struggle, his weapon slipping from his grasp. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward him, her rifle raised. She fired, taking down the nearest infected with a well-aimed shot, but the others were closing in fast. "Hold on, Mills," she screamed. In that moment, Emma's world slowed. She couldn't afford to lose another person. Not now. Not when they were so close. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she grabbed Mills by the arm and yanked him up, pulling him behind her as they ran for the safety of the bunker. The infected were hot on their heels, but Emma pushed forward, refusing to look back. The gate to the bunker was just ahead, their salvation, but the infected were closing in, their cries growing louder with every passing second. Would they make it? Would the gates hold? The fight for survival was far from over. And in the chaos of the moment, Emma knew that the true struggle had only just begun. The gates of the bunker creaked as they slammed shut behind them, the heavy metal locking into place with a resounding clang. For a moment, the survivors stood there, gasping for breath, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, the sound of it deafening in her ears. She glanced back at the others, ensuring everyone had made it inside. Private Nathan Mills, who had been injured during the escape, leaned heavily against the wall, clutching his side. His face was pale, and his breath came in short, labored gasps. Emma rushed over to him, kneeling by his side. "You all right, Mills?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. He grimaced, nodding weakly. "I'm fine, Major. Just a scratch. I've had worse." He forced a pained smile, but it did little to mask the exhaustion in his eyes. Emma nodded but wasn't convinced. The severity of their situation was sinking in. They were alive, but how long could they survive in this tiny, makeshift refuge? The infected were relentless, and their numbers were growing by the hour. Inside the bunker, the survivors began to regroup. A small, low-ceilinged room lit by flickering fluorescent lights was their new home. It smelled of stale air and cold concrete, but it was safe, at least for now. Emma moved to the makeshift command table, where maps, radios, and emergency supplies were scattered. "All right," Emma said, her voice steady but firm. "We've made it inside, but we're not out of the woods yet. The Horde is still out there, and we've got limited resources. We need to figure out what our next move is." The group of survivors gathered around her, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. They were a mixture of civilians, soldiers, and engineers, all brought together by the common goal of survival. But as Emma looked around, she could see the fear in their eyes. They were all running on empty, physically, mentally, and emotionally. "We can't stay here forever," Sergeant Alex Turner, one of the more seasoned soldiers, spoke up. His voice was strained, but there was a certain quiet authority in his words. "The infected will find us sooner or later. It's just a matter of time." "I know," Emma replied, her mind racing. "But we need to rest. We can't fight on empty stomachs or shattered nerves. We have to regroup. We'll plan our next move after we've had some time to recover." The room fell silent. Everyone knew that the clock was ticking. The infected were relentless, and their numbers were swelling. Emma didn't know how long they could hold out. But she couldn't let the fear show. "Not yet. Take shifts. Keep the perimeter secure," Emma ordered. "We rest, we recover, and then we fight." As the survivors scattered to their respective duties, Emma remained standing by the table, her mind working furiously. She knew the odds were stacked against them. They needed to find a way to break free of the Horde's encirclement before it was too late. "Major," Nathan's voice interrupted her thoughts. He was now sitting on a bench near the wall, his hands still clutching his side, but his eyes were sharp despite the pain. "I've been thinking about something. We're running low on ammo and supplies, right?" Emma nodded, her eyes narrowing. "That's right. We've got enough for a few more fights, but not much beyond that." Nathan hesitated for a moment, then continued, "What if we used their numbers against them?" Emma raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the suggestion. "Go on." He took a deep breath. "What if we set up a trap? We've got explosives, and we know they're drawn to noise. If we create a decoy, a sound, a signal, they'll come running. But instead of being in the open, we position ourselves strategically, using the terrain to our advantage. If we can funnel them into a narrow area, we could take out a large portion of the horde in one go. The idea was risky, but it was the kind of bold thinking Emma needed. It wasn't a perfect solution, but in their situation, it could work. The infected were mindless, but their numbers could overwhelm even the most well-defended position. If they could use their environment to their advantage, it might give them the edge they needed to turn the tide. "I like it," Emma said, nodding. "We'll need to set up a perimeter to lure them in, and we'll have to be quick. But if it works, it could give us a chance to make a run for the next safe zone." "Exactly," Nathan said, his eyes lighting up as he saw the plan forming. "We've got a fighting chance." Emma turned to Sergeant Turner, who had been listening closely. "What do you think, Turner? Think we can pull it off?" Turner's eyes narrowed as he considered the plan. "It's risky," he said after a long pause. "But right now, we don't have much choice. We've got to try something." Emma nodded. "All right. We'll move out at dusk. Get everything ready." As the survivors prepared for the risky mission, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of dread that gnawed at her. The odds were stacked against them. But the horde was closing in. It was either make a stand now, or die waiting for the inevitable. And Emma Carter wasn't ready to die yet. Not while there was still a breath left in her body. Not while humanity still had a fighting chance. Outside the bunker, the distant moans of the infected echoed through the night, a haunting reminder of what awaited them. Emma could only hope that their gamble would pay off. The last stand for survival had begun. The tension inside the bunker was palpable as night began to fall. The survivors gathered around, silently preparing themselves for what was to come. Emma sat at the command table, studying the map laid out before her, her fingers tracing the narrow path that led toward the makeshift decoy site. The bunker, while secure, would not remain untouched forever. She knew it was only a matter of time before the infected figured out their location. Outside, the sounds of the horde grew louder, a chorus of low moans and guttural growls carried on the wind. Emma glanced up from the map as Sergeant Turner and Private Mills approached her, both of them carrying their weapons and looking ready for the fight ahead. "We're ready, Major," Turner said, his voice steady despite the obvious exhaustion in his eyes. "The perimeter's been set. The decoy's in place, and the traps are primed." Emma nodded, appreciating the effort that had gone into preparing for the night's mission. "Good. Let's get moving." Nathan, who was still nursing his wound, shot Emma a concerned look. "You know, Major, if this doesn't work, we could be walking straight into a death trap." "I know," Emma replied, her voice firm but carrying a quiet weight. "But it's our best shot. We don't have the luxury of playing it safe anymore." Nathan sighed, but he didn't argue. He knew as well as she did that the odds were against them. The infected were too many, too relentless. The last few weeks had proven that hiding and waiting weren't viable options anymore. It was do or die. The survivors filed out of the bunker, one by one, into the cold night air. The darkened streets outside were eerily quiet. The only light came from the flickering lamps mounted along the perimeter of the bunker, casting long, distorted shadows over the cracked concrete. As Emma led the group toward the decoy site, her every step was calculated, her senses alert to every sound around her. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Turner took the lead, his rifle raised, eyes scanning every corner of the darkened alleyways. Mills, though injured, kept pace, his weapon slung across his back, ready to draw at a moment's notice. The rest of the survivors followed closely behind, their faces grim but resolute. The decoy site was set up in a narrow street, flanked by two buildings that provided natural cover. A set of explosives had been placed at the far end of the street, along with a few audio devices designed to mimic the sounds of human movement. The idea was to draw the infected toward them and lead them into a trap, then detonate the explosives at the right moment to maximize the damage. When they arrived at the site, Emma took one final look around, ensuring everything was in place. The last thing they needed was to make a mistake at this critical juncture. "We need to move fast," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Get into position." Turner and Mills took their posts at either end of the alley, while Emma and the rest of the survivors moved into cover behind nearby dumpsters and wrecked vehicles. The plan was simple: lure the infected in, set off the explosives, and then get to the extraction point as quickly as possible. The first few minutes passed in tense silence. The group crouched low, the only sounds their shallow breathing and the occasional rustle of the wind. Emma checked her watch. The decoy was timed to go off in 5 minutes. They had to be patient. Then, from the far distance, Emma heard it, the faintest sound of shuffling footsteps. Her breath caught in her throat. At first, it was just a trickle of movement, but soon it grew louder, more pronounced. The infected had been drawn in by the noise. They were coming. "Stay sharp," Emma muttered to herself, tightening her grip on her weapon. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back now. Suddenly, the silence shattered as the first wave of infected appeared around the corner. Their grotesque, decaying faces twisted into expressions of hunger, their eyes vacant and bloodshot. They stumbled forward, drawn by the sounds of the decoy. Emma's heart raced, but she kept her composure. This was it, the moment they'd been preparing for. The infected continued to flood into the narrow street, a seemingly endless mass of rotting flesh. Emma motioned to Turner, signaling that it was time. Turner nodded and set off the first series of detonations. The ground trembled as the explosion rang out, sending a shockwave through the street. The infected were caught off guard. Several of them were thrown back by the blast, their bodies shredded by the force. The noise was deafening, and the chaos that followed was both terrifying and mesmerizing. But the trap had worked. Now the horde was funneled into the confined space, unable to escape. Emma didn't hesitate. She raised her rifle and fired, taking down the nearest infected with a well-aimed shot. The survivors quickly followed suit, their weapons cracking in the night air as they fired into the mass of undead. The infected shrieked and lunged, but they were trapped, easy targets in the narrow street. But as the gunfire rang out and the infected fell, Emma felt a chill in her gut. They had underestimated one thing: the horde's adaptability. From the edge of the street, Emma saw them, the evolved infected. These were faster, more coordinated, and far more aggressive than the mindless masses they had encountered before. They moved like a unit, dodging gunfire and closing the distance far too quickly. "Back up!" Emma shouted, her voice urgent as the evolved infected charged forward. "We need to fall back." It was too late to salvage the plan. The explosion had done its job, but now they were facing a new threat, one they hadn't anticipated. The survivors scrambled, running toward the extraction point as the evolved infected bore down on them, their shrill cries filling the air. Emma's heart raced as she sprinted, urging the others forward. They had to get to the extraction point, or it would all be over. The deadly gamble had paid off, but the real fight was only just beginning. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning flesh and the sound of crackling fire. The survivors had barely managed to get away from the explosion site when the evolved infected had appeared, their speed and intelligence catching everyone off guard. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted ahead, the gunfire behind her growing sporadic. She dared not glance back, there was no time for second-guessing. All that mattered was survival. "Move, move, move!" Emma shouted, her voice carrying through the chaos. The survivors were scattered, running for their lives, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The extraction point, a fortified building a few miles from their current position, was their only hope of escape. But the horde was closing in fast, and the evolved infected were relentless. They had underestimated how quickly things could spiral out of control. Nathan Mills, injured but determined, stumbled behind her, his breathing heavy. "We're not going to make it," he gasped, his face pale. Emma didn't respond at first, her focus solely on the task at hand. She could hear the creatures behind them, their guttural growls growing louder. The survivors were scattered, and the ones in the rear were beginning to fall behind. "We will make it," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We just need to stay together." Sergeant Turner, who had been at the front, turned to look back, his rifle still raised. "They're gaining on us, Major," he called out, his voice filled with urgency. "I know," Emma replied, her mind racing. The perimeter they'd set up earlier had been compromised, and now the Horde was descending on them from all sides. Their path to the extraction point was blocked, but there was no choice but to push forward. They couldn't turn back, not now. "Emma!" shouted Lieutenant Rachel Hayes, one of the younger soldiers, as she came running up beside her. "We need a new plan. The Horde is splitting us up." Emma glanced to the side, her sharp eyes scanning the street. The infected were spread out, but the evolved ones were too close for comfort. The survivors couldn't outrun them, not like this. Without a second thought, Emma pulled Lieutenant Hayes into the shadow of a crumbling building. "We need to create a distraction," she said quickly. "Something to slow them down. Do you have any grenades left?" Rachel nodded, reaching into her pack. "A couple. But I'm not sure it'll be enough to hold them off." "It'll have to be," Emma said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "We need to buy enough time to get the survivors into the extraction point. If we don't, we'll all be dead." Rachel didn't hesitate. She pulled out a grenade, priming it and tossing it toward the nearest group of infected. It landed with a dull thud and exploded seconds later, sending a shockwave that knocked several infected off their feet. The blast momentarily halted the oncoming Horde, but Emma knew it wouldn't last long. The creatures were mindless, yes, but they adapted quickly. "Go!" Emma shouted, pulling Rachel toward the remaining survivors. They needed to push through before the distraction wore off. They moved quickly but cautiously, trying to keep low as they darted through narrow alleyways, the sounds of the infected still echoing behind them. The world around them seemed to be closing in, the night air thick with the stench of death and desperation. Emma's mind raced as she strategized their next move. "We've got to make it to the bridge," she said between breaths, her eyes scanning the horizon. The bridge wasn't far off, but it was also the most exposed part of the route. It would be their final obstacle before reaching the extraction point. They would have to cross it without being spotted, or risk being overwhelmed by the Horde. As they approached the bridge, Emma raised her hand to signal a halt. The group huddled together, crouching low behind the ruins of an old building. The bridge stretched out ahead of them, a long, exposed path with nowhere to hide. The sounds of the infected grew louder as they continued their pursuit. "We'll need to time this perfectly," Emma said, her voice tight with tension. "Once we're on the bridge, there's no turning back." Turner, still at the front, nodded grimly. "We'll make it. But we need to move fast." Suddenly, a shriek cut through the night air. It wasn't from a regular infected, it was one of the evolved ones. Emma's eyes widened as she saw the creature emerge from the shadows, its grotesque, deformed body moving with unnerving speed. It was heading straight for them, and with it, the rest of the Horde would surely follow. "We've got no time," Emma muttered. "Go now." The survivors sprinted toward the bridge, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the night. Behind them, the evolved infected shrieked again, alerting the others to their presence. A wave of the undead surged forward, faster now, driven by instinct and hunger. As the survivors reached the bridge, Emma's heart raced. She could feel the ground shaking beneath her feet as the infected closed the distance. They were almost there. "Go! Now!" Emma shouted, her voice hoarse as she pushed herself forward, urging the others to run faster. They were halfway across the bridge when the first infected reached the edge, their feral eyes locked on their prey. Emma spun around, raising her rifle. She fired, taking down the first wave, but there were too many. The bridge was their last chance, and Emma knew it. They couldn't stop now. "Keep moving," she ordered, determination flooding her veins. With one last surge of adrenaline, the survivors sprinted toward the end of the bridge, their legs burning with exertion. But as Emma neared the end, a chilling realization struck her: they were not alone. There, standing at the far end of the bridge, was something even worse than the evolved infected. A massive figure, taller than any human, emerged from the darkness, a creature unlike anything they had faced before. And with it, the true nightmare was about to begin. The massive figure at the end of the bridge stood motionless, a shadow looming over the survivors as they neared. Its body was grotesque, far larger than anything Emma had ever seen before. The moonlight caught the contours of its twisted form, revealing a hulking mass of decaying flesh, sinewy muscles, and jagged bones protruding from its skin. Its eyes glowed an unnatural, eerie red, and its mouth was a gaping maw of sharp teeth, forever frozen in a monstrous snarl. "Jesus Christ," Rachel whispered under her breath, her voice trembling with shock and disbelief. The survivors halted in their tracks, all of them staring at the creature, too stunned to move. Emma's pulse hammered in her ears. She had seen a lot during the past few weeks, hordes of infected, evolved creatures, and the relentless march of the undead, but this was something else entirely. The creature didn't move at first, its bloodshot eyes following the survivors with a menacing calm. Then, with an ear-splitting roar, it slammed its fists into the ground, shaking the very foundation of the bridge. The sound was deafening, the bridge creaking and groaning under the impact. "Fall back!" Emma shouted, her voice filled with urgency. But it was too late. The massive infected beast had already begun charging toward them, its monstrous feet pounding the ground like thunder. The survivors scattered, but Emma could feel the ground vibrating beneath her feet as the creature gained speed, a tidal wave of destruction in its wake. It was like nothing they'd encountered before. "We can't outrun it," Turner shouted, his voice strained. "We need to stop it." Emma's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. The bridge was narrow, and there were no buildings or cover to hide behind. The creature was too fast. Too strong. But they had no choice. If they didn't find a way to stop it, the entire group would be slaughtered. "Cover fire," Emma ordered, raising her rifle and aiming for the creature's head. "Everyone, open fire." The survivors, shaken but determined, took up positions behind the barricades of debris along the bridge. Their rifles cracked in unison, the sound of gunfire filling the air as they unloaded into the behemoth. But the bullets barely seemed to faze it. The creature roared again, its gaping mouth snapping open to reveal rows of jagged teeth. It swiped its massive clawed hands through the air, sending chunks of debris flying as it tore through the bridge with ferocity. Emma fired again, the bullets embedding themselves in its decayed flesh. But the creature didn't even flinch. It was like they were shooting at a wall of stone, utterly impervious to their weapons. "We need a new plan," Nathan shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. "It's not going down like this." Emma's mind was in overdrive. She could see the creature gaining on them, its massive form lurching forward with terrifying speed. They needed something to slow it down, something bigger than their guns. "Grenades," she barked, turning to Sergeant Turner. "Do we have any left?" Turner reached into his pack, pulling out the last few grenades. "A couple, Major. But they won't stop it. We need something bigger." Emma's mind flashed back to the explosives they'd set earlier as part of the decoy trap. They had a few more left, enough to make a difference, she hoped. "Get those explosives," Emma ordered, pointing toward the edge of the bridge. "We'll need to set them up right in its path. It's our only shot." Rachel was the first to move, racing toward the nearby crate of explosives. The creature was closing in fast, and the survivors had only moments before it reached them. Rachel's hands shook as she set the first explosive charge, her eyes darting nervously to the monstrous beast. The creature let out another deafening roar as it barreled forward, causing the ground to tremble beneath their feet. "Come on, Rachel, hurry!" Emma shouted, her voice tinged with desperation. Rachel quickly set another charge, her fingers working frantically to prime the device. The creature was nearly on top of them now, its growls vibrating the air. With a final, panicked twist, Rachel activated the explosives. "Boom! Now!" she shouted. The survivors scattered as the massive creature hurtled toward them, but Emma remained fixed in place, watching the seconds tick away. Then, with a blinding flash of light, the first set of explosives detonated. The ground shook violently as the explosion tore through the bridge, sending a shockwave through the air. The creature staggered back, momentarily thrown off balance, but it wasn't enough. It was still coming. Rachel threw the last grenade, and Emma braced herself for impact. The grenade detonated with a sharp crack, sending another wave of force through the air, but the creature was still standing. It was more than just a monster, it was an unrelenting force of nature, a living nightmare that would not be stopped. Emma's heart raced, panic rising in her chest as the creature came closer, the survivors' options dwindling to nothing. They couldn't outrun it, and their weapons were useless against it. But then, something shifted in the air. A strange, unnatural sound, a whirring, mechanical noise, cut through the chaos. Emma froze, her eyes widening in realization. A helicopter. It was the last hope. Over here, she screamed at the top of her lungs. The helicopter's coming. We need to move now. The survivors didn't hesitate. With the creature still reeling from the explosion, they bolted toward the far side of the bridge, where the helicopter had begun to hover just above them. The sounds of the horde were still distant, but the roar of the creature and the helicopter's whirring blades drowned everything out. As Emma and the others reached the edge of the bridge, she could hear the creature charging again. But they were almost there. They couldn't stop now. Get on the ropes! Turner shouted, his voice gruff. One by one, the survivors grabbed onto the helicopter's ropes, pulling themselves up toward the relative safety of the hovering aircraft. Emma was the last to climb aboard, her hands shaking as she reached for the rope. The creature was seconds away from reaching them. With a final, desperate heave, Emma pulled herself onto the helicopter just as the massive beast slammed into the edge of the bridge, roaring in fury. The helicopter shot into the air, narrowly escaping the creature's grasp. As they flew into the night, Emma watched the bridge recede below them, the towering terror now a distant, monstrous silhouette. They had survived, for now. But Emma knew the truth. This was far from over. The nightmare was just beginning. The helicopter ascended higher, the roar of the monstrous creature still ringing in Emma's ears. She gripped the edge of the aircraft, heart racing as they soared away from the chaos below. The bridge, now a shattered relic of the battle, faded into the distance. The survivors were safe, for now. But Emma's mind was clouded with more questions than answers. The creature, the towering terror they had barely escaped, was not just an evolved infected. It was something far worse, a new level of mutation. She had no idea how it had come to be or how many more like it lurked in the world. The infected had always been a nightmare, but this was something entirely different. Is everyone okay? Emma called out, her voice hoarse as she turned toward the survivors. The helicopter's interior was cramped, the sound of the blades above them drowning out all but the most urgent conversation. She scanned the faces of the group, noting the exhaustion, the fear, the strained expressions. Rachel was seated closest to her, her face pale but determined. "We're all still breathing," she replied, trying to offer a small, reassuring smile. "But that thing, whatever it is, it's a game changer." "Game changer doesn't even begin to cover it," Turner muttered from the rear of the chopper, where he was helping the others get situated. "I've seen a lot of things in my time, but I've never seen anything like that." Nathan, still clutching his side where he'd been wounded earlier, spoke next, his voice weak but steady. "How many more of them are out there, Emma? That thing wasn't alone." "It can't be." Emma's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the last vestiges of sunlight were sinking behind a curtain of dark clouds. The world had changed in ways no one could have anticipated, and every step they took felt like it led them deeper into uncharted, deadly territory. "I don't know," Emma said quietly, her tone grim. "But I have a feeling this is just the beginning." The helicopter continued its flight, cutting through the air as the survivors huddled together in silence. The noise of the blades, the wind whipping through the open doors, was the only sound that filled the cabin. It was a relief in one sense, but in another, it was unsettling. They were on their way to a supposed safe zone, but how could they truly be safe in a world that had mutated so horribly? "We've got about 20 minutes to the rendezvous point," the pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "Prepare for a rough landing." The area's not secure, and we'll have to take a detour to avoid possible enemy contact. Emma nodded, mentally steeling herself. A rough landing was the least of her concerns. She knew that when they landed, they would be walking into a new reality. The safe zone, though a place of potential refuge, was bound to be compromised by the same threats that had ravaged the rest of the world. The infected were everywhere. The mutated creatures were even worse. Emma stood, grabbing the edge of the chopper as the landscape below grew darker and more foreboding. She peered through the open door, taking in the terrain that lay ahead, desolate, uninhabited, and littered with the ruins of cities that had long since fallen. What would they find when they touched down? I think we need to start thinking long-term, Emma said to the group, raising her voice above the wind. That helicopter's not going to be able to make frequent trips. We'll be on our own once we're on the ground. We need to fortify, we need to scavenge, and we need to figure out how to fight back, not just against the infected, but against whatever else is out there. Turner nodded, a determined look on his face. Right. We've been surviving day by day, but we need a plan. Something that'll get us through the long haul. Nathan's face tightened with pain as he shifted his weight, wincing from his injury. And we need more than just weapons and food. We need information. What's happening to the world? What's causing these changes? Rachel spoke up, her voice trembling despite her calm exterior. And what about the creature we saw? That thing was different, Emma. It wasn't just an infected, it was something else entirely. Something, engineered, maybe? Emma's eyes darkened at the thought. Could the mutation be part of a greater experiment? Was someone, or something, behind this new outbreak? It seemed too orchestrated to be a natural evolution of the infected, but who could be behind it? I don't know, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. But we need to find out. If we can figure out how this all started, maybe we'll have a chance of stopping it, or at least understanding how to survive it. The helicopter descended rapidly as they approached the rendezvous point. Emma's thoughts were jumbled, her mind spinning with the weight of everything they had encountered so far. The world they knew was gone, replaced by a brutal, unforgiving landscape. And as the survivors readied themselves for the landing, Emma knew one thing for certain: they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for answers. With a jolt, the helicopter hit the ground, and the survivors were immediately on alert, weapons drawn and ready. The landscape was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. The rendezvous point was a small military outpost, surrounded by high fences and razor wire. As they disembarked, Emma's eyes swept over the area, scanning for any sign of danger. The gates were closed, but there was no movement inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay. Something's not right, Turner muttered as they approached the gates. This place should be active. There's no way it's been abandoned for long. Emma nodded, her gut telling her that something was off. Let's be careful. We don't know what's waiting for us. The survivors stood at the gates, the promise of safety just beyond the walls, but something in the air told Emma they were walking into another trap. Whatever had happened to the world, whatever had caused the rise of the infected and the horrifying mutations, they were about to find out. And she feared that what they'd find would be even worse than the creatures chasing them. The survivors stood at the gates of the military outpost, weapons raised and eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The eerie silence of the place weighed heavily on Emma's chest. It was as if the very air was holding its breath. They had barely touched down, but already something felt wrong. The small base should have been bustling with activity, or at the very least, showing signs of life. But the gates were locked tight, the windows darkened, and the walls were eerily still. Check for survivors, Emma ordered, her voice tight with unease. Turner and Nathan approached the gates, testing them, but the rusted locks didn't budge. The place looked abandoned, its once secure perimeter now a hollow shell. Rachel moved toward a nearby window, trying to peer inside, but the grime and dirt covering the glass prevented any clear view. Anyone inside? Emma asked, taking a step forward. She felt a surge of hope. This was supposed to be their sanctuary, their escape from the horrors they had just survived. Nothing but darkness, Rachel muttered, her hand resting on the glass, face etched with concern. I don't like this, Emma. This place feels wrong. Emma's instincts were on high alert. She looked to Turner, who had circled to the back of the base, searching for another way in. The silence seemed to stretch into eternity. But then, a faint sound broke through the quiet, a metallic screech, followed by a soft thud. Did you hear that? Nathan asked, his voice low. Before Emma could respond, the back gate of the outpost creaked open. A single soldier emerged, stumbling forward with a look of pure terror in his eyes. His uniform was torn, and his face was gaunt, as though he hadn't seen a meal in days. His hands trembled as he reached out toward them. Help, help us, he gasped, his voice cracked and weak. It's too late. They've taken everyone. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She hurried forward, catching him before he collapsed. Who's taken everyone? She asked urgently, shaking him lightly to keep him conscious. The soldier's eyes darted around frantically, as though expecting to be attacked at any moment. The infected, the evolved ones. They've mutated. They're not just the mindless things we've been fighting. They're organized. They're coordinated. He gasped again, trying to catch his breath. And there's something worse, something in charge of them. A chill ran down Emma's spine. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice rising with the tension building in her chest. Who's in charge? The soldier's face twisted with fear. It's not just the virus. It's an experiment. An evolution. There's a lab, a facility. We tried to contain it, but it spread. It spread too fast. And now they're turning everyone into weapons. They're breeding them. And there's something worse than the giant we saw, something we can't even begin to comprehend. Before Emma could press him for more details, the soldier's body went limp in her arms. His head lolled back, lifeless. He had expired in the moments between his warning and their arrival. Emma let out a sharp breath, anger and frustration clawing at her insides. No time to mourn, Turner said grimly, his voice cutting through her thoughts. If what he said is true, we need to move fast. Emma looked at the group, her eyes hard with determination. He wasn't wrong. The infected have evolved, and this is bigger than any of us could have imagined. But we're not done yet. We have to find this facility, this lab. If there's any chance of stopping this, that's where we need to go. Rachel stepped forward, her face set with resolve. So we're really doing this? We're going into the heart of the beast? Better there than sitting here waiting for it to come to us, Emma replied, a sharp edge to her voice. We know now that there's something worse out there than just mutated infected. Something orchestrating this, taking control. We need to find it, or we'll all be wiped out. Nathan, despite his injuries, nodded. I'll follow your lead. With no more time to waste, they made their way inside the base, searching for any remaining supplies and trying to figure out the layout of the area. As they combed through the rooms, it became apparent that the outpost had once been well equipped. But now, it was abandoned, papers scattered, equipment left behind in haste, and everything coated in a layer of dust. Looks like they didn't have much time to evacuate, Rachel noted. But that doesn't explain the soldier. He said there were more of them, didn't he? Emma scanned the room, her mind racing. We're going to find out soon enough. If the lab's here, we need to get to it before they do. We can't let them perfect whatever they're working on. Just then, a loud, mechanical sound echoed from deeper within the base, a faint, whirring noise followed by a sharp hiss. The group froze, their senses heightened, every nerve screaming. Emma's hand instinctively gripped her weapon as they moved cautiously toward the source of the sound. The hall ahead was dark, but a faint glow seeped out from under a door at the far end. They approached carefully, weapons ready, their footsteps echoing eerily through the empty corridors. The air felt heavy, charged with the feeling of impending danger. Emma reached for the door handle, turning it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a high-tech control room. Monitors flickered with static, some showing distorted images, while others displayed data Emma couldn't comprehend. In the center of the room stood a large, cylindrical tank filled with a thick, bubbling liquid. Inside the tank, Emma saw something that made her stomach turn, a creature, barely humanoid, its skin stretched and distorted, eyes glowing an unnatural red. "This is it," Emma whispered. "This is the lab." But as she said the words, the lights above them flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. From the far corners of the room, the sound of shifting metal and heavy footsteps filled the silence. They weren't alone. The doors slammed shut behind them with a deafening thud. And in the darkness, something stirred. Something that was far worse than the horde they had fled. The nightmare had only just begun.